The film photography revival, so wrong on so many levels. Friends, I've made a few videos about old tech revivals, vinyl records, cassettes, CDs, analogue tape in the studio, computer audio for music recording and production. But why stop there? There's a whole lot more old tech that just does not need reviving. Here we go. Film photography, or as it's sometimes known, chemical photography, because it uses, well, you know, chemicals. Yes, I know this isn't about audio, but come on, people have been asking if I couldn't be just a little more inclusive. So what's wrong with film photography, and why shouldn't it be revived? As before, I'm going to cover this in levels. Level 1, old people. It's true that old people tend to like old things, and before you quibble, I'm well qualified to comment on this. I like old things. It may surprise you that I like vinyl records. But fortunately, I'm self-aware enough to realise that it's just nostalgia. There's nothing actually good about them other than the sleeve and artwork, which, when they're good, they're very good indeed. So, old photographers are going to like film. It may be nostalgia. It may be because they can't understand this newfangled digital stuff. Or, I'll give them one good reason. They like the look of film and they don't want to spend the time finding a digital look that's similar or equally pleasing to them. Calm down! I'm not going to take away your film. Go and search for a list of photographic films on Wikipedia and you'll see that there are still loads of companies still in production. Even Kodak. So, it's not just the old photographers I want to address here. It's trendy, bearded hipsters who think there's something cool about film that hasn't been totally, utterly superseded by digital technology. And if you don't have a beard, then put down that kombucha. I know you. Level 2. Okay, on to the serious stuff. Where to begin? Okay, I'll choose grain. Like wood, film has a grain. But unlike wood, where grain can be beautiful when sanded and polished, film grain is nothing but horrible. There's nothing nice about film grain. The only one use it has is to give your photographs an illusion of authenticity, like when you're shooting UFOs or the Loch Ness Monster. Yes, film can have a very fine grain, invisible to the eye for all practical purposes. The way to achieve that is to use a slow film that isn't very sensitive to light, which kind of contradicts the whole purpose of photography. Use a faster, more sensitive film and you'll see the grain, particularly if you crop the photograph so that a smaller part of the original image is magnified. Another way to reduce the visibility of grain is to shoot a larger format. 35mm is probably the most common format, with a negative size roughly an inch high by an inch and a half wide. That's tiny to try and cram in Fiordland, Fingal's Cave, Avatar Hallelujah Mountain or Zion National Park. But 35mm back in its heyday had the advantage that the camera could be quite compact and therefore suited to street photography, action photography, shooting in a war zone. The internet will show you almost uncountable numbers of amazing photographs shot on 35mm. But you will see the compromise between convenience and grain. Take a step up to a medium format, 6x6 up to 6x9 centimetres, and the grain is much better. Good enough for a glossy magazine cover. But of course, the camera is bigger. There are larger formats still, and with each increase in format dimensions, the grain gets finer, but the camera gets bigger. Oh, by the way, I'm not saying that digital photography is entirely free from grain, but when you do happen to be roaming the shores of Loch Ness and the monster pops its head out of the water, take a shot with your digital camera and share the crystal clear image with the world. Level 3. Level 3 is the look of your photograph. Look is a handy word that encompasses contrast, colour balance, and a range of parameters that can be both measured objectively and appreciated subjectively. If you were, for instance, making a photographic reproduction of a piece of fine art, then you'd want as neutral a look as possible within the limits of the photographic process, either chemical or digital. But if you're shooting your own original photographic art, well, you're not going to want neutral. You'll want a look. So, how do you get the look you want with a film camera? I'm not going to cover lighting here, but I just thought I'd mention it so I don't get slaughtered in the comments on that. Well, you'd start off with the lens, which would be the case with digital photography too. You might add an optical filter. It won't give you kitten ears, but it could modify the colour balance or darken the sky. The film camera itself doesn't make so much difference. But then you'd consider the film stock you're using. Different stocks have different looks, and getting the look you want, or being able to achieve a range of looks, is a key part of the film photographer's skill. So, in black and white photography, for example, most of the look will come from the sensitivity of the film. A fast film will have a different look to a slow film. But there's also the contrast, and how the contrast changes up the curve from black to white, which won't be entirely linear, and we could liken it to distortion in audio, which of course can give us warmth if well controlled. In colour, there are a whole lot more variables. As an example, I'll mention the Kodachrome look. Kodachrome was one of the first colour films invented in the 1930s by two musicians. Unlike modern colour film that has the colour chemicals embedded during manufacture, Kodachrome had the colours added during processing. This gave Kodachrome a unique look unlike anything else. Photographers who loved Kodachrome, and there were many, both amateur and professional, wept and wailed and gnashed their teeth when it was discontinued in 2009 and its complex processing finally abandoned in 2011. OK, I might be banging on about this look business, but that's because it's important to photographers. Film photographers had to choose their film stock according to the look they wanted. What do digital photographers do today? Well, their digital camera captures a very accurately detailed image, encompassing more subtleties than the eye can appreciate. Then the photographer can choose the look they want at leisure after the shoot. And the range of looks is almost infinite. I just cannot see how this is not a better way than in the good old days. I invite your comment in the comments if you disagree. Level 4, ASA. This is showing my age in photographic years. Film sensitivity used to be measured in ASA, which stands for American Standards Association. The slowest film I ever used was 25 ASA. As a rule of thumb, this means that on a sunny day with the aperture set to f16, you'd need a shutter speed of 1/25th of a second, same as the ASA number, to get a good exposure. We used to call this the f16 rule, and it was a good basis for estimating exposure. f16 for sunshine, f8 for overcast, f22 for a snowscape, or an equivalent combination of shutter speed and f number. The fastest film I ever used was 400 ASA, so my shutter speed could be 1/500th of a second at f16, which is the closest to the film speed of 400. But 400 ASA, that is puny compared to digital cameras. OK, I'm going to start saying ISO now, International Organisation for Standardization. It's the same numerically as ASA, thank heavens for that. And can I just call it ISO, please? Digital cameras have variable ISO, where with film cameras you'd have to choose the ISO before you started to shoot. My Sony a6600, the camera in front of me right now, goes up to 32,000 ISO and can be boosted to 102,400. OK, so the quality suffers as the ISO goes up. But I can compare this to film like the hare to the tortoise, and unlike in the fable, this time the hare wins. One point, with film it was possible to push process by leaving the film in the developer longer. You could get the illusion of a faster speed, but in reality it just made a dimly lit negative more practical to print, and with a very coarse textured grain. I pushed quite a lot of 400 ASA rolls to 1600 ASA ISO. And although the negatives were denser, I doubt if there was any more actual information on them than if I'd processed them normally. Level 5. Processing. Yes, more on processing because I must. You're not going to believe this, but with a film camera, you can't see the image until it's processed, or developed, as you might say. This is a whole chunk of film photography that younger viewers might know nothing about, simply because they have no need to know. OK, here's how it goes. You load the camera with film, shoot, Unload the film, load it into a developing tank in total darkness, switch the light back on, pour in developer, wait, rinse, pour in fixer, wait, rinse with wetting agent, take out and hang to dry. Then, under a red light, for black and white, put a negative in your enlarger, put a sheet of bromide paper in the masking frame underneath the lens, focus, expose, develop, stop bath, fix, rinse, dry. Oh, I forgot about the test print, oh well. And judging what grade of contrast bromide paper you should use. Oh well, oh well. So, it's a long time between lining up your shot and seeing the final results. With a digital camera, you get your image instantly. And if you want to make a print, everything can be done in full daylight and it's all nice and dry. For convenience, you can of course send your film to a lab and get the prints back. But it takes time and you don't know if your shots are any good until it's too late to make any changes. Level 6, the viewfinder. I said in level 5 that with a digital camera you get your image instantly. Well, you get it even before you shoot it on the camera's screen, flipped up for a selfie, if you're using a camera similar to mine, which is exactly what I'm doing now. In the olden days, the place where the screen goes now was taken up by a square metal frame. You slip the end of the film box in there to remind you of what stock you were shooting, and most importantly, its ISO speed. To get an idea of what it was that you were actually shooting, you'd have to squint through a tiny window that replicated what the lens saw, approximately. Viewfinders worked in one of two ways. The direct viewfinder was separate from the camera lens and approximated its view. Where a camera had interchangeable lenses, there were markings inside the viewfinder to approximate further the area they would cover. Better than that, in my opinion, was the single lens reflex camera, where the viewfinder looked through the actual lens via a mirror. The mirror flipped up at the moment you pressed the shutter. So, if you were taking a wedding shot, you didn't know whether or not the bride or groom had blinked. I'm old enough to remember that in the early days of reflex cameras, the mirror flipped up when you pressed the shutter, but it didn't flip down again until you wound on the film. Going back in history, there were other forms of viewfinder. But in the present day, surely the screen on the back of the camera is an almost ideal solution. I say almost. I could sometimes wish for the screen to be reflective rather than transmissive, but that's a whole nother argument for a whole nother day. Level 7, 36 shots. I remember my first film camera as a kid. A Kodak Brownie 44A with just 3 controls: shutter, film wind and a choice of 3 apertures. No focus, no shutter speed control. It took type 127 film, giving 12 4x4cm shots on a roll. It was fun for me, nothing more than that, and certainly not artistic in any way. The major drawback was the massive cost of the film and processing in comparison with my pocket money. What luxury it was years later to have a camera with shutter speeds all the way from 1 second to 1,000th of a second, apertures from f16 to f3.5, and 36 shots per roll. 36! That was so amazing. I could take multiple shots of the same scene and choose the best one for my album later. Actually, what I learned from that, which is still a good tip today, is always take 2 shots. Half the time, the second shot will be better than the first. So you've improved your photography 100% just for that simple thing. But I digress. 36 shots. Today, I can get more than 1,000 shots on an SD card that costs less than 1 roll of film processed. And the SD card is almost infinitely reusable. Okay, so this is a bit of a double-edged sword. It's great to be able to take a lot of shots, but then you have to sort through them later. And there's always the urge to shoot lots and hope for the best, rather than put your whole effort into that one decisive moment. But should I give myself a dose of self-discipline and use an SD card that's only good for 36 shots? If one exists. Come on, that's a no. No, no, no. Level 8, winding on. I could have called this blathering on, probably. I mentioned about winding on the film earlier. I could easily have forgotten to cover this in more detail because it's so familiar in my memory. But anyone who's never used a film camera will have no idea that this had to be done after every shot. Okay, the quick explanation is that the film comes on a roll, and after every shot you have to wind on to a new section of unexposed film. Unless for an intentional double exposure, film can only be exposed once. So, in the early days, you would have a winding knob, and you could wind it. More modern cameras had a lever wind that you could flick without taking your eye from the viewfinder. As an expensive accessory, some cameras could be fitted with a motor drive. I've missed out a lot of detail there, and maybe I should have mentioned having to rewind 35mm film. But I'm going to say that in digital photography, being able to press the button, then just press it again, almost as quickly as you like, was a giant leap for mankind. Level 9. Dust. In the immortal words of Neil Young, rust never sleeps, and neither does dust. Dust, rust, is it just a coincidence that they rhyme? In film photography, or chemical photography, as I've sometimes called it, there's a constant battle against dust. The roll of processed film that comes out of your developing tank is pristine. Then 1 second later, the first speck of dust lands. Then more, then more. Most of it is hardly visible to the naked eye. But put your negative into your enlarger, or these days your scanner, and each microscopic grain of dust magnifies to clearly visible dimensions. And there are dozens or possibly hundreds on each frame. Each speck on your negative causes a very visible white spot on your final image. Photoshop, of course, is the answer, or dust removing software, which can often be a synonym for detail removing, a bit like declicking a vinyl record. The answer is, of course, to shoot digitally. Yes, a speck of dust can get onto the camera's sensor, so the problem hasn't entirely gone away. But in my 20-year experience with digital photography, I've had one speck, which the camera's self-cleaning process removed instantly. Level 9 3/4. I just thought I'd throw this one in here. Dynamic range. I have no quibble with the dynamic range of film. Both black and white and colour negative film have an excellent dynamic range between the blackest black and the whitest white. Of course, one could always hope for more, and digital photography can offer this in the high end. But film is excellent in this respect. No quibble. Which brings me to my final level for now. Level 10. You're going digital anyway. So, most of what I've said here is from my own experience, but of course I've done some research on the web to make sure my memory is correct, and of course to check other people's opinions on film versus digital. They're all wrong. No, come on. An opinion is never wrong. People who love film love it. People who have moved on to digital have seen the error of their old film ways. What I'm worried about is people who came into photography in the digital era and are now wondering whether they should see what film is all about. Oh dear, they could be making a fruitless detour that will take years. But one thing I did learn from my research is that there seems to be very little interest in going nose to tail in chemical photography, from shutter snap to paper print. The present-day route map seems to be shoot on film, processed to a black and white or colour negative, or maybe, but not so much, a colour reversal slide. And then, rather than make a print, the next step is a digital scan. Obviously, you'd use a scanner for this, but some photographers reshoot their negatives or transparencies with a digital camera. Come on. You have a digital camera. Why wouldn't you go out and shoot with it in the first place? The idea of shooting on film, then scanning the negative because you need a digital output, it just seems plain crazy to me, particularly because you've had to put up with all the problems and drawbacks of film photography just to end up with a digital image. Okay, that's it for now. I'm sure I've missed out a lot. My recollections are personal and may not resonate with yours, and my opinions are just opinions. I'm not asking anyone to throw away their film cameras if they really love them. But other than that, look, there's a lovely comments section just down there where all variations of opinion are very welcome. See you soon.